I don't know what filter this is, but I'm going to take it because it looks really nice. Anyway, hi everybody. Okay, so let's talk about rest, ice, compression, elevation, RICE, because your boy who plays a lot of tennis jacked up my ankle on the tennis court yesterday. Check it. Are you ready for it? Are you ready? Here it comes. Oh my God. Do, 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 do. There's the bruising. It's actually not super swollen, but there's the bruising. Not good. And all of the marks on my leg from the ace bandage that was on a little bit too tight. Bloop. But as you can see, the swelling's not too bad. So interestingly, for years, we always talk about rest, ice, compress, and elevate, right? Well, for the longest time, I even remember thinking about this in like nursing school, being like, okay, so but if inflammation going to the injury is actually supposed to be good for it, like healing, why are we in such a rush to get rid of the inflammation? And it was sort of always explained that like, well, too much inflammation is bad. It can cause tissue damage. Also, too much inflammation is going to be like painful because all the inflammation in an injured area like that presses on nerves and causes pain, right? So there's absolutely some truth to that for sure, but there is a lot of research recently in the last few years that like maybe trying to get rid of the inflammation so much is actually not a good thing. That you want some of that inflammation to be there so it can start the healing process. There's also something to be said for some movement with it, right? Before it was like rest, don't move, don't do anything. Well, I think depending on which, tendon or ligament you actually sprain in your ankle, depends on how much movement you should do, right? So, like, not all ankle sprains are the same, although most of them are sort of inversions. Most of them are the same one or two, tendons or ligaments that you sprain. But either way, in this case, I think it's kind of interesting. So I decided to do a little experiment on myself because I've sprained my ankle 400,000 times between volleyball, basketball, tennis for my entire life. And this time I've been walking on it. I can put pressure on it. I've been doing small exercises, but exercises that don't stretch one of those tendons on the outside. And I have less pain and I have less inflammation. It's kind of interesting. Rather than having like completely stayed off of it, iced it like all day long, every day, tons of ibuprofen, whatever. I haven't really done much of anything. Now, I think this is like a mild, like probably a 3 or 4 out of 10 on the scale of like sprained ankles, but I don't know. It's kind of interesting. So as always, this is not medical advice. Like if you sprain your ankle, you need to go see a medical professional and they can help you figure out what to do. But just thought I'd share my interesting experience with my own busted up ankle. And if you see me limping your way, don't laugh.